I sat in the dim lighting of my living room staring at the harsh, blinding glow of my phone screen. I was 31 years old today, and I was celebrating completely alone with a single vanilla cupcake from the corner bodega. The group chat named Langston Legacy had sat silent for hours, until I finally mustered the courage to break the quiet. I sent a simple, vulnerable text. Hey everyone, it is my birthday today, and I was hoping we could at least grab a quick dinner together to celebrate. The read receipts popped up one by one in rapid succession. Vanessa read it, Mom read it, Preston read it. The typing bubble danced on the screen for 3 agonizing minutes, stretching my nerves to their absolute limit. When the response from my mother Clarice finally came through, it hit me like a physical blow to the chest. Jordan, this family needs space from your constant negative energy. You never fit in with what we are building, and we are frankly better off without you dragging us down. Do not contact us again. A split second later, a small heart icon stamped itself beneath her cruel words. My perfect sister Vanessa had liked the message validating the rejection. Then Preston, my arrogant white brother-in-law, decided to add his own 2 cents to the humiliation. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps, kiddo. Time to hustle because the bank of mom and dad is officially closed forever. Stay blessed, though. He always loved using phrases he thought sounded culturally relevant while dripping with absolute condescension. I did not cry. I did not throw my phone across the room or type out a desperate apology begging for their affection like I had done so many times in the past. I simply pulled the candle from the frosting and dropped it into the trash can. For my entire life, I was the family scapegoat. I was the dark stain on my mother's flawless Atlanta high society image. While Vanessa paraded around as the golden child, the former Spelman College pageant queen, running a supposedly luxury event planning business, I was the invisible daughter who preferred spreadsheets to sorority galas and charity luncheons. They thought they held all the power in our dynamic. They truly believed that cutting me off was the ultimate punishment, that I would come crawling back to their megachurch on Sunday morning begging for a sliver of forgiveness. What they did not understand was that they had just handed me the exact permission I needed to stop protecting them from their own financial ruin. Before I dive into exactly how I dismantled their fake empire piece by piece, let me know where you are tuning in from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to finally put your foot down with a toxic family member who severely underestimated your worth. I opened my sleek laptop and rested my fingers lightly on the keyboard, taking a deep, centering breath. As a senior forensic accountant, I spent my days tracking hidden assets, exposing corporate embezzlement, and tearing apart complex financial fraud for massive international clients. I was meticulously trained to find the dirty lies hidden deep within the numbers. But my most important and delicate job was a secret I had kept perfectly hidden for 3 long years. I navigated to a highly secure private banking portal and typed in my heavily encrypted administrative credentials. The loading icon spun for a second before the screen populated, displaying the massive 8-figure portfolio of the Langston Family Trust. My grandfather, a legendary self-made real estate mogul who built entire prosperous neighborhoods in Atlanta from dirt and gravel, saw right through my parents' facade. He knew my father Desmond was a failed businessman, coasting entirely on the powerful Langston name while making terrible catastrophic investments. He knew my mother cared only about her elevated status in her exclusive social circles and maintaining her front row seat at the local megachurch. And he certainly knew Vanessa and Preston were bleeding his legacy dry to fund a completely fake lifestyle. That is why mere months before he passed away, he legally bypassed all of them in absolute secrecy. He quietly made me the sole trustee and executor of his entire estate, trusting my mind for numbers over their thirst for status. I had spent 3 years silently managing the massive funds, keeping their generous monthly allowances flowing, because despite their relentless cruelty, they were still my blood. I had rationalized their toxic behavior, hoping that keeping them financially comfortable would eventually earn me a seat at their exclusive table. But tonight, they looked me in the virtual eye and told me the bank was closed. I decided to make that an absolute undeniable reality for everyone involved. I clicked on the master control dashboard, bringing up the entire network of linked accounts. My heart beat in a slow, steady rhythm as I selected my mother's primary platinum checking account, the exact one she used to fund her lavish charity luncheons and secure her endless supply of designer wardrobes. With one clinical decisive keystroke, I changed the account status from active to permanently frozen. Next, I pulled up the corporate accounts linked directly to Vanessa's luxury event planning business. I had watched the detailed ledgers for months, knowing she was operating at a massive six-figure loss, while projecting an image of absolute perfection and generational wealth on her social media pages. I canceled the revolving credit lines, keeping her sinking ship afloat, effectively grounding her business. Then I moved my cursor to Preston. He loved acting like a high-rolling financial guru, boasting at family dinners about his supposed cryptocurrency investments while secretly relying on the family trust to cover his exorbitant daily lifestyle. I found the American Express Centurion card, the highly coveted black card he flashed at every upscale restaurant in Buckhead to look like a boss. I permanently revoked his authorized user status, flagging the card for immediate confiscation upon its next use. I did not stop there. I went through the automated transfers line by painful line. I located the recurring payment for my parents' elite country club membership and canceled it immediately without a second thought. I found the massive direct deposit covering the mortgage on Vanessa and Preston's six-bedroom suburban mansion and terminated the payment schedule, leaving them fully responsible for the next billing cycle. I revoked the corporate gas cards, the travel expense accounts, and the emergency backup funds they treated like an endless ATM. I systematically dismantled the financial safety net they had taken for granted their entire adult lives. Every dollar they spent was a dollar my grandfather had bled and sweated for, and I was completely done watching them squander his hard-earned legacy while treating me like dirt on their expensive shoes. The banking interface asked me to confirm the global freeze on all secondary access points. A bright red warning message popped up stating that these extreme actions would immediately decline any pending transactions across all linked financial institutions, causing severe disruption. I did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. I hit confirm. The screen flashed a brilliant green, indicating the updates were entirely successful across the board. I closed the laptop, feeling a profound, overwhelming sense of peace wash over my entire body. The heavy, invisible chains of familial obligation I had carried since childhood were finally broken. They wanted space from my negative energy. I was giving them exactly what they asked for, along with the total financial independence they so proudly claimed to possess. I went to my bedroom, climbed under the heavy covers, and slept better than I had in over a decade. I knew a massive destructive storm was coming by morning, but for the very first time in my entire life, I was the one controlling the weather. 12 hours later, I woke up to the harsh, jarring sound of my phone vibrating violently against my wooden nightstand. The screen lit up, displaying 99+ missed calls and a continuous flood of frantic, aggressive text messages demanding immediate answers. Before I could even swipe to read the very first message, a deafening pounding echoed through the hallway of my apartment building. Someone was practically kicking my solid front door off its metal hinges. I calmly tied my silk robe, walked into the living room, and checked the security camera monitor mounted on the wall. Preston and Vanessa were standing in my hallway, looking absolutely unhinged and desperate. Vanessa's usually flawless hair was a tangled mess, and Preston was bright red in the face, hammering his heavy fist against the wood while shouting my name. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open, standing my ground. Preston shoved his way inside, not even bothering to offer a greeting or lower his voice. He aggressively threw his sleek metal credit card onto my quartz kitchen island with a loud, sharp clatter. "What the hell did you do to the bank accounts?" he screamed, his voice cracking with high-pitched panic. "My black card just got completely declined while I was trying to pay a $15,000 deposit for Vanessa's biggest event of the entire year." The vendor laughed directly in my face. "Jordan, you need to fix it right now before I lose my mind." Vanessa pushed past him, pointing a manicured, shaking finger inches from my face. Mom is currently having a full-blown panic attack at the luxury salon because her platinum card was rejected in front of all her wealthy sorority sisters. Did you hack the accounts? Are you trying to ruin our reputations because you are throwing a childish tantrum over your stupid birthday? I turned my back on them, walked over to the espresso machine, and calmly poured myself a fresh steaming cup of coffee. I took a slow, deliberate sip, savoring the rich, dark roast while they stood there hyperventilating and demanding answers in my kitchen. You guys clearly stated you wanted space, I said, keeping my voice perfectly level and devoid of any emotion. You specifically told me the bank of Mom and Dad was permanently closed. I simply agreed with your assessment and updated the system accordingly. Preston slammed both his hands heavily on the kitchen island, leaning over to try and physically intimidate me. He used his typical condescending tone, trying desperately to sound like he was the alpha male in charge of the situation. Listen to me very closely, little girl. You are going to log into whatever back-end system you messed with and undo this mistake, right? This second before I call our corporate lawyers and have you thrown in federal prison for financial fraud. You do not play games with our generational wealth. I set my coffee mug down on the counter with a quiet thud. I looked at Preston with absolute disdain, then shifted my gaze to my sister, who was clutching her designer handbag like a sinking life preserver. I did not hack your accounts, Preston, I said, my voice dropping to a cool, clinical register that made him blink in surprise. The Langston Family Trust automatically restricts access for unauthorized users when suspicious activity is detected or when the master account holder deems it necessary. A global freeze was initiated last night to protect the core assets from further depletion. Vanessa scoffed, rolling her eyes in exaggerated disbelief. Unauthorized users. We are the primary beneficiaries, you absolute idiot. Dad manages the trust accounts and has for years. You are just a bitter community college dropout throwing a fit because you are jealous of our success. I smiled, a cold, calculated smile, leaning comfortably against the counter. That is the funny thing about official legal documents, Vanessa. People only hear what they desperately want to hear. Dad has not managed a single dime of that money since Granddad got sick 3 years ago. And bad news for you, Preston. I looked directly into his angry, panicked eyes, holding his gaze until he shifted uncomfortably. Neither you, Vanessa, nor my parents have ever been named as beneficiaries of the Langston estate. The sharp, forced bark of laughter that erupted from Preston was a textbook defense mechanism. It was that loud, hollow sound men like him make when they feel their authority slipping, but refuse to admit it. He ran a hand through his hair and shook his head, looking at me like I was a toddler who had just tried to explain quantum physics. He actually chuckled again and leaned his palms flat against my quartz island, invading my personal space. Look, Jordan. I get it, he said, his voice dripping with that unbearable condescension he always reserved just for me. You are upset about a birthday text. Feelings got hurt. But you are playing with things you simply do not understand. You took a couple of accounting classes at a community college, and now you think you are some high-level financial guru. Let me explain how generational wealth actually works in the real world, since you clearly missed that lesson. He began to pace my kitchen floor, waving his hands as if he were delivering a keynote speech at a financial summit. Generational wealth requires aggressive management, Jordan. It requires diversification, market liquidity, and high-yield protection. I am a licensed financial advisor. I manage million-dollar crypto portfolios. I am the one steering this family through volatile markets. I am the one protecting the Langston Legacy while your father transitions into retirement. You think clicking a few buttons on a banking portal makes you a mastermind. I have corporate lawyers on retainer who eat little stunt hackers like you for breakfast. If you do not reverse this lockout right now, I will have them file an injunction so fast your head will spin. You will be buried in legal fees for the rest of your pathetic life. I did not flinch. I just watched the vein throbbing in his neck. Preston had always viewed my family as his personal stepping stone. He loved attending the black tie galas, loved using our cultural slang to sound relatable, loved parading his beautiful black wife around his country club friends to prove how progressive he was. But deep down, he believed he was our savior. He truly thought he was the only one smart enough to handle the Langston fortune. Vanessa stepped up right beside him, her arms crossed tight across her chest. She looked me up and down with absolute disgust. "Do not waste your breath, Preston." She snapped, her voice shrill and trembling with rage. "She has always been like this, bitter and jealous. She cannot stand the fact that Dad chose to invest in my future instead of throwing money away on her." She took a step closer, her eyes narrowing. "You have always hated me, Jordan. You hated that I was a Spellman girl. You hated that I wore the crown. You hated that Dad happily wrote a check for my $160,000 tuition without batting an eye because he knew I was an actual investment. He called me his golden investment, remember? And what did he call you? A liability, a drain on the family resources. That is why he never paid for your schooling. That is why you had to scrape by while I built a luxury brand. You are a liability, Jordan. You always have been." Her words hung in the quiet space of my kitchen. 5 years ago, that speech would have crushed me. It would have sent me spiraling into a deep depression. But today those words just sounded incredibly hollow. They were the desperate, empty echoes of a woman who had absolutely no idea her entire life was built on a foundation of sand. I reached under the kitchen counter and pulled out a thick, leather-bound ledger. It was the master ledger of the Langston Trust, the physical copy I kept meticulously updated alongside the digital records. I set it on the island between us and slowly slid it across the smooth surface until it rested right in front of Vanessa's perfectly manicured hands. "I suggest you open it," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Vanessa scoffed and looked away. "I am not looking at your fake spreadsheets, Jordan. Open it," I commanded, the sudden sharp authority in my voice making both of them jump. Preston snatched the ledger and flipped it open to the bookmarked page. His eyes scanned the columns of numbers and dates. I watched his arrogant expression slowly melt into utter confusion. Vanessa peered over his shoulder, her brow furrowing as she tried to make sense of the financial records. "Let me translate that for you, since Preston is apparently struggling with basic accounting," I said, walking around the island to stand directly across from them. "Those are the wire transfer records from the year you started at Spellman, Vanessa. Notice the dates and the originating accounts. Dad did not pay your tuition. Dad could not even pay his own car note that year." Vanessa's head snapped up, her eyes flashing. "You are a liar. Dad wrote the check to the bursar's office himself." "Dad wrote a check from an account that had already been drained," I corrected her. "Look at the ledger, Vanessa. 6 months before you packed your bags for college, Desmond Langston took $250,000 from the family business operating account and lost every single penny of it at a casino in Biloxi. He was drowning in gambling debt. He was on the verge of bankruptcy. Granddad found out and nearly had him arrested for embezzlement." Preston shook his head furiously, pointing a finger at the page. "This is fabricated. Desmond is the managing director of the estate." "Desmond is a figurehead," I replied, staring Preston down. "Granddad stripped him of all financial authority 5 years ago. He knew his son was a degenerate gambler. He knew Clarice would spend the rest of the fortune on designer shoes and church donations to buy her way into heaven. So he legally transferred everything into a blind trust and made me the sole trustee. He gave me absolute discretionary power over every single cent attached to the Langston name." I tapped the page right where Preston's thumb was resting. "I paid your Spellman tuition, Vanessa, every single semester. I authorized the wire transfers from the trust because despite how horribly you treated me, I did not want Granddad's legacy tainted by Dad's failure. I paid for your books. I paid for your housing." And Preston looked at the entry from 2 years ago. Preston looked down, and the color completely drained from his face. "That's $60,000 down payment on your precious Porsche?" I said, tilting my head. "The one you bragged about buying with your crypto earnings. Your crypto wallet was overdrawn, Preston. You cried to Dad about needing a loan to keep up appearances. Dad came crying to me. I approved the discretionary disbursement. I bought your car. I bought your degree, Vanessa. I am the bank, and the bank is permanently closed. For a long, heavy moment, the kitchen was completely silent. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator. Vanessa stared at the ledger, her mouth slightly open. The reality of her entire existence was crashing down around her. The myth of the golden child, the illusion of the wealthy white savior husband, the lie of the supportive rich father. It was all gone, replaced by the cold, hard truth that the sister she had mocked and degraded for her entire life had been quietly keeping a roof over her head. Then the denial set in. It was swift and violent. No, Vanessa shrieked, slapping the ledger off the counter. It hit the floor with a heavy thud. You are insane. You forged this. You hacked into the accounts and forged these documents to make yourself look important. You are a psychotic, jealous liar. She reached into her designer purse and pulled out her phone. Her hands were shaking so badly she almost dropped it. She jabbed her fingers against the screen and hit the speaker button, holding the phone up like a weapon. 911. What is your emergency? The dispatcher's voice echoed through the kitchen. Yes, I need police immediately, Vanessa screamed, her voice shrill and hysterical. My sister has lost her mind. She is committing massive financial identity theft. She hacked into our family trust accounts, and she is stealing our money. She is completely deranged, and she is holding us hostage in this apartment. You need to send officers right now before she does something dangerous. Ma'am, please calm down. What is your location? The dispatcher asked. Vanessa rattled off my address, crying fake tears as she paced back and forth. She hung up the phone and glared at me with absolute triumph. You are going to jail, Jordan. You think you are so smart, but you are just a common thief. Dad is going to press charges, and Preston will make sure you are locked away for decades. Preston crossed his arms, regaining a tiny fraction of his false confidence. You really played yourself this time, kiddo. You should have just stayed out of the way. I walked back to my coffee mug and took another sip. The rich hazelnut flavor was incredibly soothing. You do know that making a false police report is a misdemeanor in the state of Georgia, right? I asked casually. And falsely accusing a licensed fiduciary of financial crimes carries severe civil penalties. Shut up, Vanessa screamed, pacing the floor like a caged animal. Just shut up. Within minutes, the wail of sirens pierced the quiet morning air of my upscale complex. The sound grew louder and louder until it stopped abruptly right outside my building. Heavy footsteps pounded up the stairs and down the hallway. Before the police could even knock, the front door was thrown wide open again. Clarice stood in the doorway, breathing heavily. My mother had clearly rushed over straight from her salon appointment. She was wearing a silk blouse and her hair was only half styled, but her face was twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. She had obviously received a frantic text from Vanessa while the police were being called. Two uniformed police officers appeared right behind her, their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts. They stepped into the entryway, assessing the situation. Officers, thank God you are here, Clarice yelled, pointing a dramatic, trembling finger directly at me. Arrest her. She is a thief and a hacker. She froze all of our family bank accounts and she is squatting in my property. I want her removed in handcuffs right now. The taller officer stepped forward, looking between my screaming mother, my hysterical sister, and me, calmly leaning against the counter holding a coffee mug. Mom, he said, addressing me carefully. We received a call about financial theft and a domestic disturbance. Can you step away from the counter and explain what is going on here? Of course, officer, I said, placing my mug down and standing up straight. There is no domestic disturbance. My sister and brother-in-law let themselves in and began shouting because their credit cards were declined this morning. Liar, Vanessa shrieked, trying to push past the officer. She stole our money. She hijacked our trust fund. Ma'am, step back, the second officer warned, putting a hand up to stop Vanessa. Clarice stepped around Vanessa, crossing her arms and raising her chin. I am the matriarch of this family, she declared, using her favorite phrase. This apartment was purchased by the Langston family business. This is my property. I want her evicted for trespassing and arrested for cybercrimes. She has no right to be here. I nodded slowly, keeping my movements very calm and deliberate. Officer, I understand tempers are high right now, but my mother is mistaken about the ownership of this residence. May I reach into my blazer pocket to retrieve a document? The officer watched me closely and nodded slowly. I reached inside the inner pocket of my tailored blazer and pulled out a thick folded piece of heavy stock paper. It was not a copy. It was the original document bearing the bright raised seal of the Fulton County Superior Court. I unfolded it carefully, smoothing out the creases, and handed it directly to the commanding officer. The tall officer took the heavy parchment from my hand. He adjusted his stance and began to read the text. I watched his eyes scan the legal jargon, tracing the lines of ownership that I had meticulously established years ago. Clarice crossed her arms over her chest, wearing a triumphant smirk. She looked at the younger officer standing near the doorway and sighed heavily. "I apologize for the inconvenience, officers," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "My daughter has been struggling with severe mental health issues. She dropped out of college years ago and has been harboring this dangerous jealousy toward my successful children. We only came here today to get her the psychiatric help she clearly needs, but she became violent and delusional." The commanding officer did not look up from the document. He flipped to the second page, examining the notarized signatures and the bright raised seal of the Fulton County Superior Court. The silence in my kitchen stretched out, becoming thick and suffocating. Preston shifted his weight, looking nervously between the officer and the front door, where several of my affluent neighbors had started to gather in the hallway. They were watching the spectacle unfold through the open doorway. Finally, the officer folded the document and handed it back to me with a respectful nod. He turned to face my mother, and his expression was completely devoid of the sympathy she was trying to manipulate out of him. "Mom," he said, his voice loud enough for the gathering neighbors to hear clearly, "you stated earlier that you are the owner of this property." Clarice lifted her chin. "Yes, officer. My husband and I purchased this unit through our family business. We allowed her to stay here out of charity." The officer shook his head. "That is factually incorrect, Mom. According to this certified deed, this property is owned outright by a private limited liability company. Furthermore, this document clearly identifies Jordan Langston as the sole registered owner and managing member of that LLC. She is the legal property owner. You have absolutely no ownership claim to this residence." The triumphant smirk vanished from my mother's face instantly. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Vanessa let out a sharp gasp and grabbed Preston's arm. Preston stared at the officer, his face turning a blotchy shade of crimson. "That is impossible," Preston stammered, stepping forward. "You are reading a forged document. I am a financial advisor. I know how these shell companies work. She printed that off the internet to confuse you. You need to arrest her." The officer rested his hand firmly on his duty belt and stepped directly into Preston's personal space, forcing him to back up. "Sir, I have been doing this job for 20 years, and I know a certified county deed when I see one," he stated sharply. "The only people committing a crime here today are the three of you. You entered this woman's home uninvited. You attempted to file a false police report claiming she was a squatter. You are currently trespassing on private property. Now you can either walk out that front door right now, or I can arrest all three of you for trespassing and filing a false police report." I watched the absolute horror wash over my mother's face. For a woman whose entire existence revolved around her pristine reputation in Atlanta high society, this was her worst nightmare realized. I glanced past her toward the hallway. Mrs. Davenport, a prominent judge, and Mrs. Sterling, the president of my mother's own sorority chapter, were standing by the elevators watching the entire humiliating exchange. They were whispering to each other, their eyes wide with shock. Clarice saw them too. I watched her perfectly manicured hands begin to tremble. The pristine, flawless image she had spent decades cultivating was shattering right in front of her most influential peers. The officer gestured toward the door. "Time to go, folks," he ordered. "Right now." The younger officer moved forward, placing a firm hand on Preston's shoulder and guiding him toward the exit. Vanessa stumbled backward, her designer heels catching on the threshold, but Clarice dug her heels into the hardwood floor, refusing to go quietly. The humiliation had mutated into a toxic, desperate rage. She whipped her head around to face me, her eyes burning with a hatred so deep it made my chest ache. "You think you have won?" she hissed, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper that only I could hear. You think because you tricked your sick grandfather into giving you control of his money that you are suddenly untouchable. You are nothing, Jordan. You are a bitter, lonely little girl who will never belong in our world. I stood perfectly still, letting her words wash over me without giving her the reaction she craved. Tonight is the Atlanta Heritage Charity Gala. She continued, her voice trembling with malice. It is the most important night of the year for our community. Every influential family, every major investor, every prominent figure in the city will be in that ballroom tonight. And I am going to make sure every single one of them knows exactly what kind of monster you are. I am going to tell them how you manipulated a dying man, how you stole from your own family. I will ruin your professional reputation so thoroughly that no accounting firm in this state will ever hire you again. You will be an absolute pariah. Ma'am, move it along, the commanding officer warned, stepping between us. Clarice smoothed her silk blouse, clinging desperately to whatever shred of dignity she had left. She turned and marched out the door, her head held high, even as the police officers escorted her past her whispering friends in the hallway. Preston and Vanessa followed closely behind, keeping their heads down to avoid the judging stares of my neighbors. The heavy wooden door clicked shut behind them, leaving me standing alone in the sudden deafening silence of my apartment. I did not collapse. I did not cry. I walked back to the kitchen island, picked up my coffee mug, and took a long, slow breath. My mother had just declared a public war. She intended to use the Atlanta Heritage Gala to destroy my career and paint me as a criminal before I could expose the truth about their financial ruin. She was banking on the fact that I had always been the quiet one, the one who avoided the spotlight, the one who would shrink away from a public confrontation. She expected me to hide in my apartment while she controlled the narrative. She had vastly underestimated the woman I had become. I walked down the hall and entered my home office. It was a sterile, highly functional room filled with multiple high-resolution monitors, encrypted servers, and stacks of external hard drives. This was my sanctuary. This was where I tore apart fraudulent empires for a living. I sat down in my ergonomic chair, booted up my primary workstation, and logged into my secure forensic accounting software. If my mother wanted to make tonight about financial integrity, I needed to ensure I had every single receipt perfectly aligned. I already knew Preston and Vanessa were draining the family trust, but I had never looked deeply into the specific mechanics of their personal businesses. I had simply monitored the outflow from the trust to their accounts. Now I needed to know exactly where all that money was going and why they were so desperately panicked about the accounts being frozen this morning. I started with Vanessa's luxury event planning company. She paraded it around Atlanta as a massive success, securing features in local magazines and boasting about her high-profile clientele. I accessed the public tax filings and cross-referenced them with the corporate banking records I had secured through the trust. It took me less than 45 minutes to find the gaping, bleeding hole in her business model. Vanessa was not running a profitable company. She was running a massive, elaborate Ponzi scheme to fund her own lifestyle. She was taking massive deposits from new clients to pay off the vendors from previous events. She had zero liquid capital. Her operating accounts were completely drained. But that was not the most shocking discovery. The real horror lay in the specific wire transfers moving out of her business accounts. Hundreds of thousands of dollars were being systematically siphoned out of her corporate accounts and wired into a series of obscure offshore shell companies. I traced the routing numbers, running them through a specialized database used for tracking corporate embezzlement. The shell companies were registered in the Cayman Islands, but the ultimate beneficiary was a cryptocurrency trading platform. I leaned closer to the monitors, my eyes darting across the endless rows of transaction data. Preston. He had convinced Vanessa to grant him full access to her corporate accounts under the guise of acting as her chief financial officer. He was silently bleeding her company dry, taking her clients' deposit money and dumping it into highly volatile, unregistered cryptocurrency markets. He was chasing massive returns, trying to become the billionaire crypto genius he always pretended to be. But the market had crashed hard last quarter. The ledgers showed catastrophic losses. Preston had lost nearly $800,000 of Vanessa's client money in a matter of weeks. That explained the frantic behavior this morning. Vanessa needed that $15,000 deposit to pay the florist for an event happening this weekend, because Preston had already gambled away the original funds she received from the client. When I froze the trust accounts, I cut off their only lifeline. They were using my grandfather's estate to quietly replace the money Preston was losing in the crypto markets. But the puzzle was not complete. The trust disbursements I had been approving over the past year were substantial, but they did not add up to the massive gap in Preston's trading portfolio. He needed more capital to cover his margins. He needed a massive injection of cash to keep his creditors at bay. I pulled up the property records for the greater Atlanta area, searching for any recent filings under Preston's name or his associated shell companies. My breath caught in my throat when the search results populated on the screen. 2 weeks ago, Preston had secured a massive high-interest commercial loan from a predatory private lending firm. The loan was for $1.2 million. In order to secure a loan of that magnitude, with his terrible credit history and failing crypto portfolio, he needed to put up a flawless, high-value asset as collateral. I clicked on the loan documents, bringing up the digital scans of the collateral agreements. He had used Big Mama's house, the ancestral Langston family home. The beautiful sprawling estate that my great-grandparents had built from the ground up during the segregation era. The property that held generations of our family history, our holiday gatherings, our most sacred memories. Granddad had placed the deed to the house in a separate holding company meant to be preserved forever. But my father Desmond was still listed as a managing director of that specific holding company from a careless administrative oversight years ago. Preston had manipulated my father into signing over the deed to the ancestral home, using it as leverage to secure his shady loan. He had bet our entire family legacy on a collapsing digital currency market. If he defaulted on that loan, the private lending firm would immediately seize the house and sell it to the highest bidder. And looking at his completely depleted accounts, I knew he had already missed the first payment. I sat back in my chair, the glowing monitors illuminating the dark room. The sheer scale of their betrayal was staggering. They had not just stolen money, they had gambled away our heritage. They had risked the very foundation of the Langston name just to maintain their arrogant illusions of grandeur. My mother wanted to stand in front of the Atlanta elite tonight and call me a thief, while her golden daughter and white savior son-in-law were actively destroying our family history. I minimized the windows on my screen and opened a new secure folder. I began downloading every single ledger, every wire transfer receipt, every crypto trading log, and the commercial loan documents containing Preston's and my father's signatures. I organized them into a clear, undeniable chronological presentation. I exported the entire file onto a small encrypted silver USB drive. I ejected the drive from the port and held it in my palm, feeling the heavy metallic weight of absolute truth. I stood up and walked into my master bedroom. The sun was beginning to set over the Atlanta skyline, casting long, dramatic shadows across my floor. I walked over to my closet and pulled out the protective garment bag hanging in the very back. I unzipped it, revealing a stunning floor-length tailored emerald green evening gown. It was sharp, sophisticated, and commanded absolute authority. I had bought it months ago for a corporate awards banquet, but had never worn it. I laid the dress carefully on the bed and set the silver USB drive right next to it. My mother had promised to make me an outcast tonight. She had promised to stand in a ballroom full of the most powerful black families in the South and tear my name to pieces. She wanted a high society spectacle to prove her dominance and hide her failures. I looked at my reflection in the full-length mirror, adjusting my posture until I stood perfectly straight. "You wanted a high society spectacle, Mother," I said to the empty room. "Let us give them a show." The Atlanta Heritage Charity Gala was the absolute pinnacle of the city's elite social calendar. The massive ballroom of the Grand Hotel was a sea of opulent wealth and carefully curated reputations. Crystal chandeliers the size of small vehicles cast a warm golden light over the crowd. Valets rushed back and forth outside, while inside the room was packed with politicians, mega-church pastors, and prominent sorority women wearing their signature colors. I walked through the towering double doors wearing my tailored emerald green gown. The heavy silk moved fluidly with every step I took, projecting an aura of absolute control. I did not rush. I took my time scanning the massive ballroom, letting my eyes adjust to the sheer volume of fake smiles and aggressive networking. It did not take me long to spot my mother. Clarice was holding court near the center of the room, exactly where she always positioned herself to ensure maximum visibility. She was wearing a custom beaded gown that probably cost more than my first car. I drifted closer, staying just out of her direct line of sight, but perfectly positioned to hear every single word falling from her mouth. She was surrounded by a highly influential group, including Pastor Williams from her sprawling megachurch and several women who sat on the board of her prestigious sorority. Clarice was dabbing the corners of her eyes with a delicate lace handkerchief, playing the role of the heartbroken matriarch to absolute perfection. "It has just been so devastating, Pastor Williams," my mother said, her voice trembling with manufactured grief. "We gave Jordan everything. We tried so hard to include her in the family business, but she has always been so troubled. The negative energy she brings into our home is just exhausting. And now she is having some sort of severe psychiatric breakdown." Pastor Williams placed a comforting hand on my mother's shoulder. "The Lord tests us with our children, Clarice," he murmured in his deep, resonant voice. "You must remain strong." One of the sorority board members shook her head, sighing dramatically. "I heard she locked you out of your own bank accounts today, Clarice. How could a daughter be so incredibly greedy and spiteful after all the sacrifices you made for her education?" My mother let out a small, tragic sob. She manipulated her poor, sick grandfather when his mind was failing. She forced him to sign papers giving her control, and now she is trying to leave her own father penniless out of pure spite. I do not know how she sleeps at night. She is completely mentally unstable. We are looking into getting her institutionalized for her own safety, of course. I listened to her spin this massive, intricate web of lies to the most powerful gossips in Atlanta. She was laying the groundwork to have me socially exiled and legally committed just to maintain her access to my grandfather's money. I took a step forward, sliding smoothly into the tight circle of elites. The heavy silk of my gown rustled quietly as I stopped directly next to Pastor Williams. "Actually, Mother," I said, my voice projecting clearly over the low hum of the ballroom, "the only thing breaking down today is your line of credit." The circle went dead silent. Pastor Williams pulled his hand back from my mother's shoulder as if he had been burned. The wealthy sorority women stared at me, their eyes wide with shock at my sudden appearance and my incredibly calm demeanor. My mother froze her lace handkerchief, hovering inches from her face. The tragic victim routine completely vanished from her eyes, replaced by a sharp panic. "Jordan," she hissed through a tightly clenched jaw, "what are you doing here? You are not on the guest list." "I am a Langston," I replied, offering a polite, flawless smile to the pastor before turning my gaze back to her. "I am always on the guest list, but I could not help overhearing your creative storytelling, Mother. It is fascinating how you managed to twist federal financial law into a personal tragedy." I turned my attention to the small crowd she had gathered. "My mother seems to have forgotten a few key details about our family estate," I explained, my tone pleasant and conversational. "For instance, my grandfather was of perfectly sound mind when he structured his trust. He legally bypassed my parents because my father lost $250,000 of company operating funds at a casino in Biloxi. And as for the bank accounts freezing today, that was an automated security measure triggered because my sister and her husband were actively embezzling funds to cover their cryptocurrency debts." Clarice stepped forward, trying to physically block me from the pastor. "How dare you speak to your mother this way in public?" she demanded, her voice rising in pitch. "You have no respect. You have no decency. You are a disrespectful child making up disgusting lies to embarrass your own family in front of the church." "Respect is earned, Mother," I countered, my voice dropping to a cool, clinical register that cut right through her hysteria. "And embezzling from an estate is a federal crime. I did not lock you out of spite. I locked you out because you have collectively drained hundreds of thousands of dollars that do not belong to you." I looked directly at Pastor Williams, who was suddenly looking very uncomfortable. In fact, Pastor, you might want to check the source of the generous tithing checks my mother has been handing you this year. I am currently auditing those transfers, and the IRS tends to frown heavily on donations made with stolen funds. The pastor's face went completely ashen. He took a very deliberate step backward, physically distancing himself from Clarice. The sorority sisters exchanged alarmed glances, suddenly realizing that standing too close to my mother might drag them into a massive financial scandal. Clarice stood there, sputtering, completely unable to form a coherent sentence as her most valuable social allies began to scatter. She tried to grab my arm, but I stepped out of her reach, smoothing the fabric of my dress. I left her standing alone in the middle of the ballroom, her flawless reputation cracking under the weight of undeniable facts. I turned my back on her and glided through the crowded room, making my way toward the VIP section, where the real money resided. The heavy hitters of Atlanta real estate and finance always claim the tables near the front of the stage. I grabbed a glass of sparkling water from a passing server and drifted closer to a particularly loud table. Preston was standing there in his expensive tailored tuxedo, looking perfectly in his element. He was surrounded by a group of highly successful older black men, mostly prominent doctors, dentists, and surgeons who were known for investing heavily in local developments. Preston was passing around thick, glossy brochures, leaning over the table with that arrogant, confident swagger he always used to mask his incompetence. I stepped behind a massive floral arrangement just a few feet away, listening closely to his pitch. "Gentlemen, this is the opportunity of a lifetime," Preston was saying, his voice dripping with fake sincerity. "I am developing a massive commercial luxury complex right in the heart of the most historic district in the city. The zoning is already approved and the architectural plans are finalized. I am just looking for a few key seed investors to get the ground cleared." One of the surgeons flipped through the brochure, looking impressed. "And you are securing our seed money with what exactly, Preston? We need guarantees before we move funds of this size." Preston smiled broadly, looking incredibly proud of himself. "I am putting up my own property as the sole collateral. It is a massive historic estate, fully paid off, and owned, free and clear, by the Langston family. I hold the deed. Your investments will be completely risk-free because the land value alone covers your initial buy in 3 times over." He tapped the address printed on the back of the brochure. I listened to the address and my blood went ice cold. It was the exact address of Big Mama's house. Preston was standing in front of the wealthiest men in the city, actively running a secondary scam. He had already used the ancestral home to secure a high-interest predatory loan just days ago, and now he was trying to sell the exact same collateral to these doctors. He was double-leveraging a property he did not even legally own to gather enough raw cash to flee the country before the banks noticed his defaults. It was a spectacular display of absolute sheer audacity. The gala host stepped up to the main stage, tapping the microphone to get the room's attention. He announced that it was time for the annual Langston Legacy presentation, a tradition my family had sponsored for a decade. Usually my father Desmond would waddle up to the stage and deliver a pompous, empty speech about community values. I saw my father adjusting his jacket, preparing to walk up the steps. I moved faster. I walked right past my father, leaving him staring in shock as I ascended the carpeted stairs and walked directly to the center of the main stage. I approached the audio-visual technician standing off to the side and handed him the encrypted silver USB drive I had brought from my office. I gave him a curt nod, instructing him to plug it directly into the main projection system. I stepped up to the microphone, looking out over the sea of faces. I locked eyes with Preston, who was suddenly frozen at his VIP table, the glossy brochure slipping from his hand. "Good evening, everyone," I said, my voice echoing cleanly through the massive ballroom. "My name is Jordan Langston, the sole executor and trustee of the Langston estate. My family has been telling you some incredibly fascinating stories tonight, but numbers always tell a much better one. Let us look at the math." I signaled the technician to hit play. The massive high-definition projector screen behind me flickered to life with a low mechanical hum. Instead of the usual heartwarming montage of smiling family photos and community service awards, the screen filled with stark black and white spreadsheets. A wave of confusion rippled through the grand ballroom as the affluent guests squinted at the massive columns of numbers and dates. I gripped the edges of the wooden podium, feeling the smooth, polished grain beneath my fingertips. "Good evening, esteemed guests." I began, my voice projecting evenly and clearly across the sudden quiet of the room. Every single year, my parents stand on this exact stage and talk to you about the Langston legacy of integrity and financial stewardship. But legacy is a very heavy burden to carry, especially when it is being hollowed out from the inside by the very people claiming to protect it. I clicked the small remote in my right hand, and the screen zoomed in on a specific corporate bank statement. "This is the primary operating account for Vanessa Langston Event Planning," I announced. "As you can see from the glossy brochures on your tables, it is a business that projects absolute luxury and unparalleled success. But if we take a moment to actually follow the money, we see a very different and disturbing reality." I clicked the remote again, highlighting a series of massive wire transfers in bright yellow. Over the past 8 months, hundreds of thousands of dollars in client deposits have been systematically drained from this operating account. This money did not go to florists or caterers or luxury venue rentals, it went here. The screen shifted with a click to display a complex, tangled web of offshore shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands. A collective gasp echoed through the ballroom as the prominent doctors and pastors began to realize exactly what they were looking at. I continued my presentation with the cold clinical precision of a forensic audit, letting the facts speak entirely for themselves. The ultimate destination for these funds was not a high-yield mutual fund or a secure real estate investment. The money was funneled directly into highly volatile, unregulated cryptocurrency trading platforms managed solely by my esteemed brother-in-law, Preston. I pointed directly at his table near the front of the stage where the group of wealthy surgeons he had just been pitching to were now staring at him in absolute horror. Preston has been playing financial roulette with Vanessa's client money. I explained, my voice remaining perfectly level and detached. He has been acting as her chief financial officer, using her legitimate business as his own personal piggy bank to fund his digital gambling addiction. And unfortunately for everyone involved, he is not a very good gambler. I brought up the final crypto portfolio ledger. The numbers on the screen glowed in a bright, angry red, indicating catastrophic financial failure. In less than 6 months, Preston managed to lose nearly $800,000 in failed crypto trades. He effectively bankrupted his wife's event planning company, leaving her with zero liquid capital and a mountain of unpaid vendor invoices. The quiet murmurs in the ballroom erupted into a chorus of shocked whispers and outraged gasps. I watched the prominent mega-church pastors whispering furiously to each other, clearly recalculating their social and financial relationship with my mother. My father, Desmond, was frozen near the stage steps, his face completely slack as he stared up at the undeniable proof of his own sons-in-law's embezzlement. The entire room of Atlanta high society was watching the flawless Langston empire crumble in real time, and there was absolutely nothing they could do to stop the bleeding. I looked down at the VIP table and watched the blood completely drain from Vanessa's face. She was staring at the massive screen behind me, her perfectly contoured features contorted in absolute raw shock. The illusion of wealth and success she had sacrificed everything to maintain was being broadcast to the very people she so desperately wanted to impress. But Vanessa was nothing if not deeply conditioned to protect her public image at all costs. Instead of turning her anger toward the husband who had just destroyed her business, she directed her frantic panic straight at me. She pushed back her chair so hard it crashed to the carpeted floor. "She is lying!" Vanessa screamed, pointing a shaking, manicured finger at the stage. Her voice was shrill and frantic, carrying over the growing noise of the bewildered crowd. "Jordan is a psychotic, jealous liar. She doctored these documents because she is obsessed with ruining my life. Do not listen to her. She is a community college dropout who hacked into my system to create fake spreadsheets. She was hyperventilating, desperately trying to convince the wealthy wives and socialites around her that this was all just an elaborate, jealous prank. But numbers do not lie, and the powerful people in this room knew exactly how to read a financial statement. The wealthy surgeons at Preston's table were already physically backing away from him, pulling their chairs back and setting down their drinks in disgust. Preston stood up, his face turning an ugly mottled shade of crimson. The arrogant swagger he had been parading around the ballroom just moments ago was completely gone, replaced by a violent, panicked rage. He shoved past a waiter, sending a silver tray of champagne glasses crashing to the floor, and stormed toward the stage. "Shut off that screen right now," he demanded, his voice booming with forced authority as he climbed the first few steps. "This is a targeted defamation campaign. None of this is real. I am a licensed financial advisor, and this woman is committing corporate espionage." He took another heavy step toward me, his hands balled into tight fists, trying to use his physical size to intimidate me into silence. "Turn off the projector, Jordan," he growled, taking another heavy step. "You are embarrassing yourself, and you are violating federal privacy laws. I will have you arrested before you even leave this hotel." I did not flinch. I did not take a single step backward. I simply looked down at him from the podium. "You cannot arrest the legal trustee for auditing her own accounts." "Preston," I said calmly. "Every document on that screen was obtained legally through my capacity as the sole executor of the Langston Trust. The same family trust you have been secretly draining to cover your massive margins." Preston stopped dead on the steps, his chest heaving as he tried desperately to regain control of the narrative. The wealthy investors he had been courting were watching him with absolute revulsion. The white savior complex he wore like a badge of honor was completely shattering in a room full of black excellence. He turned to face the crowd, throwing his arms wide in a frantic plea for validation. "This is absolute garbage," he yelled, his voice cracking slightly under the immense pressure. "My crypto portfolios are perfectly fine. I am completely solvent. I just secured a massive multi-million-dollar commercial real estate loan this week. You all know me. I am developing the historic district. I have the deed to Big Mama's house. It is in escrow right now, backing my entire enterprise. I have millions in collateral." He was practically vibrating with panic, trying to use our ancestral home as a shield to prove his financial stability. The mention of Big Mama's house sent a ripple of absolute horror through the older generation of Atlanta elites who knew exactly what that property meant to our community. It was a beacon of survival and success from the segregation era, and he was bragging about using it as poker chips. My mother let out a strangled cry from the back of the room, finally realizing the true devastating extent of the damage her golden son-in-law had caused. I smiled, leaning slightly into the microphone. "You put the ancestral home up as collateral for a high-risk predatory loan," I said, my voice carrying a quiet, lethal authority. "You manipulated my father into signing over the deed to cover your tracks, but you missed your very first payment on Tuesday, Preston." The entire crowd went dead silent, hanging on my every word. "The bank declared the loan in default immediately," I continued, "and they sold the debt to a private acquisitions firm to recoup their losses." I reached into my evening clutch resting on the podium and pulled out a thick folded piece of heavy stock paper. I held it up, letting the bright stage lights catch the official embossed seal. "Guess who bought your debt this morning?" I asked, keeping my eyes locked on his terrified, sweating face. "I bought it, Preston. I paid off your default using the very trust you tried to steal from, and I legally transferred the deed into my own private holding company." I leaned closer to the microphone, delivering the final crushing blow. "I am your debt collector, Preston." The microphone feedback echoed through the grand ballroom as the weight of my words finally crushed Preston's arrogant facade. The group of wealthy doctors and surgeons at his table did not even wait for him to respond. They simply stood up, adjusted their tailored jackets, and walked away, leaving the glossy investment brochures sitting on the table like discarded trash. One of the prominent surgeons, a man my father had been trying to court for years for his own business ventures, leaned down and told Preston he was an absolute disgrace before turning his back entirely. The room erupted into absolute chaos. The quiet, polite murmurs of Atlanta high society transformed into a roaring wave of scandal and judgment. Vanessa buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably as the realization that she was financially ruined washed over her perfectly contoured face. Clarice tried desperately to grab the arms of passing sorority sisters and megachurch pastors, begging them to listen to her side of the story, but they treated her like she had a contagious disease. In the exclusive world of the Atlanta elite, there is no greater sin than faking your wealth and stealing from your own blood. They wanted nothing to do with a family whose entire empire was built on a crumbling foundation of embezzlement and crypto gambling. I did not stay to watch them scramble like rats on a sinking ship. I handed the microphone back to the pale audiovisual technician, smoothed the heavy silk skirt of my emerald green gown, and walked down the side steps of the stage. The crowd parted for me, offering me a wide, clear path straight to the exit. No one dared to stop me. No one dared to whisper about my clothes or call me a dropout or a liability ever again. I walked out of the Grand Hotel and handed my ticket to the valet, feeling the cool night air against my skin. I drove home to my condo, feeling a profound, overwhelming sense of closure. The heavy, invisible chains of familial obligation I had carried since childhood were finally broken. The truth was out there in the open, where it could not be manipulated or hidden behind fake smiles and charity luncheons. But I knew my mother better than anyone on earth. Clarice Langston was a cornered animal, and a cornered animal is incredibly dangerous. She would not accept public humiliation without attempting to completely destroy the person who exposed her. She would rather burn the entire family legacy to the ground than admit she had lost control. The very next morning, the fallout was swift and brutal. My phone was flooded with text messages from cousins, aunts, and former family friends who had seen the videos of the gala circulating online. I ignored all of them, pouring myself a cup of black coffee and watching the morning news. I was just sitting down at my kitchen island when a sharp, aggressive knock echoed through my apartment. I checked the security camera, expecting to see Preston or Vanessa coming to beg for mercy or scream about their frozen accounts. Instead, it was a man in a plain gray suit, holding a thick manila envelope. I opened the door and the man handed me the envelope without a single word before turning and walking away. It was a formal legal summons. My parents had filed an emergency injunction and a lawsuit against me, demanding an immediate mediation hearing to contest the validity of the Langston family trust. They were pulling out all the stops, trying to drag me into a brutal legal battle to regain control of the money they so desperately craved. 48 hours later, I walked into the sleek, glass-enclosed boardroom of one of the most ruthless corporate litigation firms in downtown Atlanta. I was accompanied by my own corporate attorney, Marcus, who was fully briefed on every single financial discrepancy I had uncovered in my audit. The room smelled of expensive leather, harsh chemical cleaners, and pure desperation. My family was already seated on the opposite side of the massive mahogany table, looking like they were preparing for a war. Clarice sat perfectly straight, her hair immaculate, her face arranged in a mask of supreme smug confidence. She looked like a woman who was holding a royal flush and was simply waiting for the right moment to ruin her opponent. Desmond sat beside her, looking pale, exhausted, and incredibly nervous, deliberately refusing to make eye contact with me. Vanessa and Preston sat at the far end, glaring at me with a toxic mixture of hatred and fear. Preston's arrogant swagger was completely gone, replaced by the twitchy energy of a man who knew he was facing federal prison time if he could not secure a massive payout today. Sitting at the head of their side of the table was a slick, high-priced attorney named Richard Sterling. He was exactly the kind of lawyer who specialized in bullying, making aggressive threats, and finding dirty legal loopholes for wealthy clients who had made terrible, catastrophic mistakes. He flashed a predatory, shark-like smile as Marcus and I took our seats across from them. "Let us get straight to the point." Richard began, leaning forward and resting his elbows on the polished wood. "My clients are prepared to offer a very generous settlement to avoid dragging this unfortunate family dispute through open court." You will immediately relinquish all control of the Langston Trust hand over the deed to the ancestral home and sign an ironclad non-disclosure agreement regarding the events at the gala. In exchange, my clients will gracefully decline to press federal charges against you for elder abuse and financial fraud. Marcus let out a short, dry laugh, shaking his head as he opened his own briefcase. You have absolutely no legal grounds for those accusations, Richard. My client is the legally appointed trustee designated by her grandfather in a sound state of mind. She has operated with full fiduciary responsibility, while your clients have committed rampant documented embezzlement. We have the ledgers. We have the bank records showing the offshore crypto transfers. You have absolutely nothing to leverage here today. Clarice leaned over the table, her eyes locking onto mine with a sickeningly triumphant glare. You were always so smart with your little numbers, Jordan, she purred, her voice dripping with fake honey-coated sympathy. You thought you outsmarted all of us. You thought you could just steal our legacy because you were jealous of what we built. But you forgot one very important detail, little girl. You forgot that your grandfather loved your father more than he trusted you. He would never leave his only son destitute to appease a bitter dropout grandchild. Richard Sterling reached into his leather briefcase with a highly theatrical flourish. He pulled out a crisp manila folder and extracted a single sheet of heavy premium bond paper. He slapped it down onto the center of the mahogany table, sliding it across the smooth surface until it stopped directly in front of Marcus and me. This, Richard said, his voice echoing loudly in the glass room, is a legally binding codicil. For those who do not understand complex estate law, Jordan, it is an official legal addition to a will. It was signed by Theodore Langston exactly 3 days before he passed away. In this document, he explicitly revokes your status as trustee and hands full absolute control of the entire estate directly to Desmond Langston. Vanessa let out a small, cruel laugh from the end of the table, crossing her arms over her chest. Preston sat up a little taller, looking incredibly pleased with himself, as if he had just won the lottery. You see, Jordan, my mother said, her voice laced with pure venomous victory. Your grandfather came to his senses at the very end. He realized what a terrible, catastrophic mistake he made, giving a liability like you any power over our legacy. This document nullifies everything you have done. It invalidates the bank lockout. It invalidates your fraudulent purchase of the deed to Big Mama's house. You have zero authority over us anymore. I did not react to her taunts. I kept my face completely blank as I reached out and pulled the document toward me. Marcus leaned in close, his eyes scanning the dense legal jargon covering the page. But I was not reading the paragraphs. My forensic accountant training took over immediately, shifting my focus from the threatening words to the physical characteristics of the document itself. I had spent years analyzing forged corporate documents and sniffing out fraudulent paper trails. I looked closely at the date stamped at the top. I analyzed the placement of the text, the slight unnatural pressure of the pen strokes, and the specific blue hue of the ink used for my grandfather's supposedly final signature. The ink was pooling in tiny microscopic ways that indicated it had not been drying in a dark safe for 3 years. It was fresh. It was vibrant. The weight of the paper felt identical to the premium stock sitting in the printer right outside this very boardroom. They had panicked after the gala and manufactured a fake codicil, hoping to scare me into handing over the keys before anyone looked too closely. Clarice leaned over the table, her eyes wide with frantic triumph. You are finished, she hissed, pointing a sharp manicured finger at me. You have 24 hours to hand over the keys to the trust, or we send you to federal prison for elder abuse. Jordan picks up the codicil, her forensic accountant eyes narrowing at the ink. I sat in the cold leather chair and slowly pulled the heavy bond paper closer to my side of the mahogany table. The room was so quiet I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning cycling through the ceiling vents. Clarice sat across from me, radiating an arrogant, toxic triumph, while Desmond stared at his expensive shoes, completely unable to meet my gaze. I did not panic. Panic is an emotion reserved for amateurs and people who do not understand how numbers work. I reached down to the floor and lifted my sleek leather briefcase, setting it on my lap with a deliberate, quiet thud. I popped the brass latches and reached inside my fingers, brushing past my encrypted hard drives until I found my specialized forensic toolkit. I pulled out a small black velvet pouch and extracted a professional-grade jeweler's magnifying loupe. Vanessa scoffed loudly from the end of the table, rolling her eyes so hard it looked painful. "What are you doing, Jordan?" she muttered, her voice dripping with extreme annoyance. "Are you playing detective now? Stop wasting our time and just sign the paperwork." I ignored her completely. I brought the magnifying loupe up to my right eye and leaned down over the document. I focused entirely on the signature at the bottom of the page. The letters spelling out Theodore Langston were perfectly legible, but the forensic details were completely wrong. I traced the micro-pooling of the blue ink along the curves of the signature. The ink had not settled into the paper fibers the way it would have if it had been locked inside a dry safety deposit box for 3 years. It was fresh. The chemical composition of the ink was still vibrant, and the microscopic feathering along the edges indicated it had been printed from a high-end laserjet printer very recently. I moved the loupe slightly, checking the date typed just above the signature line. August 14th. I lowered the loupe and placed it gently onto the glass surface of the table. I looked directly at Richard Sterling, the slick, expensive attorney, who was currently adjusting his silk tie and looking entirely too pleased with himself. I needed to ensure the trap was perfectly set before I sprung it. "Mr. Sterling," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level and devoid of any emotion, "you are officially presenting this document today during a formal mediation session. Is that correct?" Richard offered a predatory, patronizing smile, leaning back in his chair and crossing his arms. "That is exactly correct, Jordan," he replied, his voice echoing slightly in the glass room. "It is a legally binding codicil that explicitly supersedes any previous trust arrangements." I nodded slowly, keeping my eyes locked on his. "And you are submitting this as federal evidence. You are stating for the official record that you have verified its authenticity, and you intend to file this with the probate court to formally contest my status as the sole trustee of the Langston estate." Clarice slammed her hand flat against the table. "Stop stalling, Jordan." She snapped, her patience completely running out. "He just told you what it is. We have the upper hand now. You thought you could lock us out of our own money, but your grandfather knew you were a vindictive little girl. He fixed his mistake before he died." I ignored my mother entirely, keeping my focus strictly on Richard. "I need verbal confirmation from opposing counsel," I stated calmly. "Are you formally submitting this specific document as federal evidence today, Mr. Sterling?" Richard scoffed, letting out a short, arrogant laugh. "Yes, Jordan," he declared, puffing out his chest. "I am proudly submitting this as federal evidence. I have already drafted the filings for the probate court, and I am fully prepared to present this codicil to the trust board immediately. You have absolutely no legal ground to stand on anymore." I smiled. It was a small, cold, clinical smile that made the confident sneer falter slightly on Richard's face. I reached back into my leather briefcase and pulled out a thick red folder. The folder was heavy, stuffed with hundreds of pages of officially sealed documents. I dropped it onto the center of the mahogany table right next to their freshly printed forgery. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. As a senior forensic accountant, I spend my entire life operating on the principle of absolute verification. I explained, my voice dropping to a low, steady register that demanded total silence. "People lie, Mr. Sterling. Families lie. Desperate, greedy people lie constantly. But timelines never lie. Medical records never lie." I opened the heavy red folder and pulled out a stack of papers bearing the official watermarks and embossed seals of Emory University Hospital. I turned the stack around and pushed it smoothly across the table until it rested directly in front of Richard. "That date on your supposed codicil is truly fascinating," I continued, leaning forward and steepling my fingers. "August 14th. You are claiming my grandfather sat down and signed a highly complex legal document completely revoking my authority on August 14th. Preston shifted uncomfortably in his chair, wiping a sudden bead of sweat from his forehead. He signed it while he was in his home office. Preston blurted out, his voice cracking slightly under the pressure. "I was there. I saw him do it. I shifted my gaze to Preston, letting the absolute silence hang in the air for a long, agonizing moment before I spoke again. You saw him sign it in his home office on August 14th, I repeated, making sure the statement was recorded clearly in the minds of everyone in the room. That is an incredibly impressive trick, Preston. Because according to the certified medical records sitting right in front of your attorney, Theodore Langston suffered a massive catastrophic stroke on August 10th. The color completely drained from Desmond's face. He suddenly looked like he was going to be violently ill. Clarice grabbed the edge of the table, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the wood as the terrifying reality of my words began to sink in. I kept my voice perfectly steady, delivering the facts like a judge reading a final sentence. On August 10th, my grandfather fell into a deep, unresponsive coma, I stated. He was immediately transported by ambulance to Emory University Hospital. He was admitted to the intensive care unit and placed on full life support. He was heavily intubated, breathing through a machine with zero brain activity. I know this because I was the only person sitting next to his hospital bed holding his hand while the rest of you were out shopping and attending charity galas with his money. I stood up from my chair, looming over the table. I pointed a single finger at the forged document. He remained completely unconscious and fully intubated in that hospital bed until his heart finally stopped 3 days later. So I would love for you to explain to me, Mr. Sterling, how a man in a deep vegetative coma, breathing through a plastic tube, managed to magically transport himself from an intensive care unit to his home office, pick up a pen, and sign a legally binding codicil on August 14th. Richard Sterling stared at the certified medical records in front of him. His hands began to shake visibly as he flipped through the pages, seeing the official signatures from the attending neurosurgeons and the detailed daily life support logs. The slick, predatory arrogance completely melted off his face, leaving behind nothing but pure, unadulterated terror. He was a high-priced, sleazy attorney who bent the rules for wealthy clients, but he was not an idiot. He knew exactly what he was looking at, and he knew exactly what it meant for his career and his freedom. He looked up slowly, turning his horrified gaze toward Desmond and Preston. The realization hit him like a physical blow. They had set him up. They had manufactured a fake legal document and used him as their personal shield to file it. "You forged this," Richard whispered, his voice trembling with sheer panic. "You brought me a forged testamentary document and told me it was authentic." Preston stood up his chair, scraping violently against the floor. "Now wait a minute, Richard," Preston stammered, holding his hands up defensively. "We can explain. There was just a mix-up with the dates. We can fix the dates and refile it." "Fix the dates!" Richard screamed, his voice echoing off the glass walls of the boardroom. "You absolute idiots! You cannot fix the dates on a forged document after presenting it during a formal mediation. You just made me submit a fabricated will as federal evidence." Richard frantically grabbed his expensive briefcase and threw it onto the table. He began shoving his files and pens inside with wild, uncoordinated movements. "Submitting a forged document to a trust board constitutes federal wire fraud," he yelled, spittle flying from his lips as he glared at my father. "You have committed conspiracy to commit fraud and elder abuse. If this goes to a federal judge, we are all looking at decades in a penitentiary. I am not losing my law license and going to federal prison because you two are too stupid to check a calendar before committing a felony." Richard snapped the latches on his briefcase shut and grabbed his suit jacket. He pointed a shaking finger at Desmond. "I am formally withdrawing as your legal counsel effective immediately," he declared, his voice shaking with panic. "Do not ever contact my office again. If the authorities ask, I will testify that you misled me. You are completely on your own." Richard turned and sprinted out of the glass boardroom, throwing the heavy door open and disappearing down the hallway without looking back. He abandoned them right there in the mediation room, leaving them entirely defenseless against the storm they had just created. The room was plunged into a stunned, terrifying silence. The reality of their situation was crashing down on them with devastating force. Clarice was hyperventilating, her hand clutching her chest as she stared at the door where their expensive lawyer had just fled. Desmond was staring blankly at the wall, completely paralyzed by the knowledge that he was facing federal prison time. Preston was pacing near the window, muttering to himself like a trapped animal. I did not sit back down. I slowly walked around the edge of the massive mahogany table, my heels clicking sharply against the polished floor. I stopped right behind my father, resting my hands lightly on the back of his leather chair. I leaned down until my face was hovering just inches from his ear. "You did not just lose the mediation, Dad." I whispered, my voice cold and calm, slicing through the heavy silence of the room. "You just handed me written, undeniable proof of a federal crime." I straightened up and shifted my gaze down the table to where Vanessa was sitting. She was trembling violently, her hands clasped tight in her lap. I looked at the bottom of the forged document, noting the official notary stamp pressed into the corner of the page. It was the stamp she used for her event planning business contracts. I smiled, a slow, calculated smile that made the blood completely drain from her face. "And Vanessa," I said, letting the silence stretch out for one final agonizing moment, "you notarized it." I left the glass boardroom without looking back at the shattered remains of my family. The suffocating smell of expensive leather and desperate panic faded the moment the heavy doors clicked shut behind me. I took the private elevator down to the parking garage, feeling a profound sense of quiet victory. The drive back to my accounting firm was peaceful. The city lights of Atlanta blurred past my window, painting the interior of my car in flashes of neon and gold. It was late in the evening, and the towering corporate building was completely empty. I swiped my security card and rode the elevator up to my floor. The pristine, modern office space was totally silent, except for the low, steady hum of the computer servers in the back room. I walked into my corner office and sat down behind my large oak desk. I had won the mediation, but the real work of untangling Preston's massive financial mess was just beginning. I opened my laptop and began sorting through the encrypted files I had compiled over the past few weeks. I was deep into reviewing a complex spreadsheet when the tranquil silence of the floor was violently shattered. I heard the heavy reinforced glass doors of the main lobby crash open. The sound echoed down the long hallway like a gunshot. It was immediately followed by the frantic, aggressive clicking of high heels slamming against the polished concrete floor. Someone was sprinting toward my office. I did not even have time to stand up or reach for my phone before my solid wood door was shoved open with terrifying force. The heavy metal handle crashed into the drywall, leaving a deep, noticeable dent. Vanessa stood in the doorway, and she was entirely unrecognizable. The flawless, poised pageant queen facade that she had spent her entire life carefully cultivating was completely obliterated. Her expensive, tailored silk blouse was wrinkled and heavily stained with sweat. Her perfectly styled hair was a tangled, chaotic mess sticking to her wet, flushed cheeks. She looked like a wild, cornered animal acting purely on blind panic. She barged into my office, her chest heaving violently as she gasped for air. "You ruined everything!" she screamed, her voice cracking into a shrill, high-pitched shriek. "You ruined my entire life, Jordan!" She lunged forward and grabbed a heavy crystal paperweight off the corner of my desk. Without a second's hesitation, she hurled it across the room. It smashed into the far wall, sending jagged shards of glass raining down onto the plush carpet. I did not flinch. I sat perfectly still in my leather ergonomic chair, watching my older sister completely unravel before my eyes. She paced back and forth in front of my desk, violently swiping a stack of manila folders onto the floor, sending confidential financial reports scattering across the room. "I am facing federal prison time," she wailed, digging her long, manicured nails into her scalp. Richard called the district attorney the exact second he left the building. "The bank is already freezing my event planning accounts. My reputation in Atlanta is dead. The board members are resigning from my charities. Nobody will even answer my phone calls." She was completely losing her mind, collapsing under the crushing weight of her own catastrophic choices. "You did this to me," she cried, pointing a visibly shaking finger at my face. "You could have just given us the money. You have a highly successful firm. You did not even need Granddad's trust. You just wanted to destroy me because you have always been jealous of my success." She grabbed a ceramic coffee mug from a side table and threw it blindly toward the window. It bounced off the reinforced glass and shattered into tiny pieces across the floor. Her chest heaved as she looked around my office, searching for something else to destroy, but her energy was rapidly fading. The adrenaline of her ambush was wearing off, leaving nothing but pure, unadulterated terror in its wake. I remained seated, resting my hands calmly on the cool surface of my desk. I let her scream and throw her violent tantrum, watching the years of toxic, built-up resentment finally boil over. The hysteria was brutally stripping away every single layer of her fake polite society persona, revealing the terrified, greedy woman hiding underneath. We had a plan. Vanessa sobbed, her legs finally giving out. She collapsed into the leather guest chair opposite my desk, pulling her knees up to her chest and rocking back and forth like a frightened child. We had it all figured out. We just needed a little more time to make it work. The IRS was already auditing Preston. They started looking into his offshore crypto accounts last month. We needed raw liquid cash to pay the federal tax penalties before they froze his assets and indicted him for tax evasion. Mom said Granddad was leaving the entire estate to you, and we knew we could not let that happen. Her eyes were wild and completely unfocused as she confessed the entire dark, twisted conspiracy right there in my office. "We knew about your depression," she blurted out, her voice dropping to a desperate, manic whisper. "We knew you struggled heavily after you dropped out of your first college program years ago. Mom and I talked about it for weeks, trying to find a solution. We knew that if you had a documented mental breakdown, we could file an emergency petition in the county probate court. We could have a judge declare you mentally unfit to act as the trustee of the estate. That was the only possible way we could gain legal control of the accounts to save Preston from the IRS audit. We researched the medical codes and the legal precedents. We knew exactly how fragile you used to be. The pieces fell into place with sickening absolute clarity. That is why Mom sent that cruel birthday text," I said, my voice dropping to a cold, clinical register. "That is why she publicly called me a disappointment and mocked my lack of a husband in front of the entire family. You specifically wanted to trigger a severe depressive episode. You orchestrated months of emotional warfare, hoping I would collapse under the weight of her psychological abuse." Vanessa nodded her head violently, her tears mixing with her dark mascara and running in ugly streaks down her cheeks. "Yes," she cried out, her voice echoing loudly off the office walls. "I told her to do it. I told her to push your buttons and humiliate you as much as possible. We wanted you to snap Jordan. We wanted you to go crazy so we could record your reaction and use it as medical evidence against you in front of a federal judge. We just needed you out of the way so we could access the trust. We did not want to hurt you, we just needed the money to save my marriage. But you did not break down," she continued, her voice shaking uncontrollably. "You just stood there and smiled at us. And then Granddad died, and the automated bank security locked us out. We panicked. Preston said he could fix everything if we just signed that specific codicil. He told me it was a standard legal maneuver. He promised me he would protect my business and my reputation. He promised me the crypto trades would magically bounce back and cover the missing funds before anyone even noticed." She buried her face in her trembling hands, letting out a long, agonizing wail of pure despair. "He used me, Jordan. My own husband used my legitimate company to steal money, and my mother let him do it because she genuinely thought he was a better investment than you." I looked up slightly at the small blinking red light in the upper corner of my office ceiling. The high-definition security cameras were recording every single word of her hysterical, legally damning confession. I did not yell back at her. I did not match her frantic, chaotic energy. I spoke with a chilling, terrifying calmness that made her look up from her hands in sheer absolute terror. "You traded your soul, Vanessa," I said, leaning forward slightly and locking my eyes onto hers. "You actively plotted to trigger your own sister's mental breakdown just to steal from your dead grandfather. You tried to weaponize my past trauma. And for what exactly? For a man who lied to your face and robbed your loyal clients blind. You threw away your morality and your freedom to protect a digital gambling addict because you were too terrified of losing your prestigious country club membership and your luxury cars. You could have walked away. You could have turned him in. But your pride would not let you admit that you married a failure." Vanessa stared at me, her mouth opening and closing without making a single sound. The reality of my words was sinking into her skin like ice. You let our mother use you as a shiny trophy your entire life. I continued, my voice slicing through the quiet room like a surgical scalpel. She paraded you around Atlanta high society, using your beauty and your blind obedience to build her own social status. She taught you from a very young age that looking perfect was far more important than being honest or decent. And when your perfect husband bankrupted your entire life, she happily helped you forge a federal document to steal my inheritance rather than admitting her golden son-in-law was a massive fraud. You ruined your own life, Vanessa. You let greed and vanity drive you straight into a federal conspiracy. I just refuse to let you ruin my life to pay for your mistakes. I will not save you from the consequences of your own malicious choices. You are going to have to face the authorities and explain exactly why you put your official notary stamp on a forged will. You are going to have to explain to a judge why you conspired to declare your sister mentally unfit to cover up an IRS audit. Vanessa opened her mouth to beg for mercy when a loud, sharp buzzing sound interrupted her. My cell phone vibrated violently across the smooth wood surface of my desk. The screen lit up with an urgent, bright red notification. It was the advanced security system I had personally installed at Big Mama's house the very moment I legally purchased the deed from the acquisitions firm. The alert indicated that the reinforced back door of the ancestral estate had just been violently breached by an intruder. I picked up the phone, tapping the screen to bring up the live outdoor security feed. I watched the grainy green-tinted night vision footage as a familiar, desperate figure repeatedly kicked the heavy wooden door frame until the lock finally splintered and broke. I looked back up at my older sister, who was still sobbing weakly in the leather guest chair. "Keep crying, Vanessa," I said, holding the glowing phone screen up so she could see the live video feed clearly. "Your husband is currently breaking into a federal crime scene." 10 miles away, across the dark, sprawling city, Preston was completely suffocating under the crushing weight of his own massive hubris. The crisp, tailored tuxedo he had worn to the gala just 48 hours ago was gone, replaced by a dark hooded sweatshirt clinging to his back with cold, terrified sweat. He swung his heavy boot forward, smashing the sole of his shoe against the reinforced back door of Big Mama's house. The wood splintered and groaned, but refused to give way immediately. He swung his boot again, and the heavy wooden frame of the back door finally gave way with a loud, violent crack. He stumbled into the dark, silent kitchen of the ancestral Langston estate, breathing heavily, his chest heaving with pure, unadulterated panic. He was a man running entirely on the toxic fumes of desperation. The walls were closing in around him at a rapid, terrifying speed. His offshore crypto accounts in the Cayman Islands had been entirely frozen. His fake real estate deals had evaporated the moment I exposed his massive financial fraud at the Heritage Charity Gala. He knew with absolute sickening certainty that the federal authorities were already auditing his fake ledgers. He had maybe 3 hours to gather enough raw, untraceable capital to pay a smuggler to fly him out of the country on a private charter plane. He pulled a heavy steel crowbar from his canvas duffel bag and crept through the dark, quiet hallways of Big Mama's house. He did not care about the history of the property or the legacy of the Langston family. To Preston, this house was just a giant piggy bank waiting to be smashed open. He moved quickly, heading straight for the master bedroom at the end of the long corridor. He knew exactly what he was looking for. My grandfather, Theodore Langston, had been a deeply cautious man who never fully trusted the modern banking system. He had spent decades accumulating a legendary collection of antique jewelry. There were heavy vintage gold pieces, thick diamond tennis bracelets, and unappraised emerald necklaces hidden away in a secret floor safe. It was worth millions of dollars in raw physical assets that could be easily liquidated in any black market across the globe. Preston just needed to get that safe open, shove the velvet boxes into his duffel bag, and disappear into the night before the federal agents showed up at his front door. He dropped to his knees in the center of the master bedroom, shoving the heavy antique Persian rug out of the way. He used the sharp, flat edge of the steel crowbar to violently pry up the false oak floorboards, grunting with exertion as the old wood splintered and cracked under the immense pressure. He tossed the broken boards aside, revealing the heavy gray steel dial of the hidden floor safe. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely grip the metal dial. He took a deep, ragged breath, trying to force his racing heart to slow down. He wiped the cold sweat from his forehead, leaving a smear of dirt and grease across his pale face. He had watched Vanessa input the combination once years ago, and had secretly memorized the numbers, filing them away for a rainy day. Well, it was officially pouring and he was about to cash in his insurance policy. He placed his trembling fingers on the cold steel dial. Turn left to 42, turn right past 0 to 17, turn left to 88, turn right to stop. He held his breath, praying to a god he did not believe in that the combination was still accurate. A heavy, loud metallic click echoed through the silent bedroom, the locking mechanism disengaged. Preston let out a loud, manic laugh of pure, hysterical relief. He grabbed the heavy iron handle and pulled the thick steel door open, exposing the dark cavity of the floor safe. He dropped his crowbar and eagerly shoved his hand into the dark opening, fully expecting his fingers to brush against the soft velvet of expensive jewelry boxes. He reached deeper, blindly groping the cold metal bottom of the safe. There were no boxes. There was no gold. There were no diamonds. His frantic fingers brushed against a single thin piece of paper, sitting completely alone in the center of the empty steel vault. Preston grabbed the piece of paper, pulling it out of the dark hole. At that exact moment, the heavy overhead lights of the master bedroom snapped on, flooding the room with blinding, brilliant light. Preston gasped, throwing his hands up to shield his eyes as he scrambled backward across the hardwood floor like a terrified, trapped rat. He slammed his back against the wall, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with absolute sheer terror as his vision finally adjusted to the bright light. I stood perfectly still in the doorway of the master bedroom, wearing a tailored charcoal gray power suit with my arms crossed neatly over my chest. I was flanked by two massive, highly trained private security contractors wearing black tactical gear. They stood perfectly silent, entirely blocking the only exit out of the room. "You seem a little lost, Preston," I said, my voice perfectly calm and clinical, echoing cleanly off the bedroom walls. "The airport is in the opposite direction." He stared at me, his jaw hanging open, completely unable to form a single coherent sentence. He looked down at the piece of paper crushed in his trembling fist, and then back up at me, his mind struggling to process the reality of the trap he had just walked directly into. I stepped slowly into the room, the sharp click of my heels breaking the heavy, suffocating silence. "Go ahead and read it," I instructed, pointing a single manicured finger at the crushed paper in his hand. "Read what it says, Preston." He slowly unfolded the piece of paper, his hands shaking so badly the paper rattled. He stared at the bold, typed letters printed across the center of the page. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly in his throat. "Looking for a bailout, Preston?" He read aloud, his voice weak and raspy. I offered him a cold, merciless smile. "That is exactly right," I said, gliding closer to where he sat trembling on the floor. "Did you honestly think I would leave millions of dollars in untraceable raw physical assets sitting in a dusty floor safe while you and my sister were actively draining the corporate operating accounts?" The very first thing I did when I took over as the sole executor of the Langston Trust was audit the physical inventory. The exact day I noticed your incredibly sloppy offshore crypto transfers, I hired a secure transport team. I moved every single piece of Granddad's legendary antique jewelry collection to a highly classified, climate-controlled subterranean vault in downtown Atlanta months ago. You are currently staring at an empty steel box because I have been 10 steps ahead of your pathetic little grift since day one. Preston pushed himself up against the wall, trying desperately to stand, but his legs refused to hold his weight. He looked at the two massive security contractors blocking the door and realized he was completely trapped. The arrogant financial advisor who loved to bully and manipulate my family was reduced to a pathetic, whimpering mess. "Jordan, please," he begged, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. You have to let me go. You do not understand what is happening. The people I borrowed money from to cover the crypto margins, they are not like the people at the country club. They are dangerous. If I do not leave the country tonight, they are going to kill me. I can sign over anything you want. I can give you my car, my watches, whatever is left in the accounts. Just tell your guys to step aside and let me walk out the back door. I looked down at him, feeling absolutely zero sympathy for the miserable creature groveling at my feet. You do not have any watches or cars left to give me, Preston. I explained, my tone completely devoid of any emotion. The bank has already initiated asset seizure protocols on every single piece of property tied to your name. You bankrupted your wife's company, you forged a federal document to steal my inheritance, and you destroyed the Langston family legacy for a few failed crypto trades. You do not get to walk out the back door and disappear to a tropical island. You get to stay right here and face the absolute total destruction of the life you stole. He opened his mouth to beg again, but the words died in his throat. Suddenly, the dark shadows stretching across the front lawn were violently pierced by bright flashing red and blue lights. The brilliant strobing colors swept across the master bedroom windows, painting Preston's terrified pale face in alternating shades of crimson and sapphire. The heavy, rhythmic crunch of tactical boots marching up the front porch steps echoed through the quiet house. Preston scrambled to his knees, looking frantically at the flashing lights outside the window. You called the cops! He gasped, his eyes wide with wild manic panic. You called the Atlanta police for a simple breaking and entering charge. I can post bail for that, Jordan. You are not stopping me. I stepped back, smoothing the lapels of my tailored suit jacket. I shook my head slowly, offering him one final chilling look of absolute victory. I did not call the local cops for a simple breaking and entering charge, Preston. I said, my voice dropping to a quiet, lethal whisper. A massive booming crash echoed through the house as the heavy wooden front door was violently breached by a steel battering ram. The sound of dozens of heavy boots swarming into the ancestral home shook the very floorboards beneath our feet. Loud, deep voices began echoing down the main hallway, barking tactical commands and securing the perimeter of the property. I called the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, I announced, stepping gracefully to the side to give the armed federal agents a clear, unobstructed view of the miserable man kneeling on the floor. And they have a few highly specific questions about your tax returns. The harsh fluorescent lights of the Fulton County Probate Court illuminated the absolute ruin of the Langston family. I sat perfectly upright at the plaintiff's table with my hands folded neatly over my leather briefcase. The courtroom was dead silent, except for the shuffling of thick paper, as Judge Harrison reviewed the towering stack of federal evidence I had officially submitted. Across the wide center aisle, my family sat looking like a row of broken, shattered porcelain dolls. Desmond was staring blankly at the polished wood table, his shoulders completely slumped in total defeat. Clarice kept wiping her face with a shredded tissue, her expensive makeup running down her neck in dark, ugly streaks. Vanessa sat next to her mother, trembling violently and refusing to make eye contact with anyone in the room. But the most pathetic sight was Preston. He was seated at the far end of the defense table wearing a bright orange county jail jumpsuit. His wrists were locked in heavy steel handcuffs, chained directly to a metal ring fastened to the heavy oak table. The smug, arrogant financial advisor who had tried to steal my inheritance was completely gone. The federal agents had dragged him out of my grandfather's house in handcuffs, and the IRS Criminal Investigation Division had spent the last 72 hours tearing his entire life apart. They found the offshore crypto accounts, they found the fake ledgers, and they found the massive gaping holes in his federal tax returns. He was facing decades in federal prison, and he knew it. Judge Harrison let out a long, heavy sigh and removed his reading glasses. He looked down at my family from his elevated bench, and his face was twisted in profound, absolute disgust. I have presided over this court for 22 years, Judge Harrison said, his deep voice echoing across the empty gallery. I have seen greedy relatives fighting over silver spoons in old houses, but I have never in my entire career seen a family orchestrate such a malicious, coordinated, and highly illegal conspiracy against one of their own blood. He picked up the freshly printed forgery that Richard Sterling had tried to submit during the mediation. He held it up for the entire courtroom to see. "You fabricated a legally binding testamentary document," the judge continued, staring directly at Desmond. "You forced a notary to stamp it under false pretenses. You attempted to use the United States court system to formally strip your daughter of her rightful inheritance. And when that failed, your son-in-law physically broke into the ancestral estate to steal millions of dollars in antique jewelry to fund his escape from federal authorities. The absolute sheer audacity of this conspiracy is staggering." Desmond opened his mouth to speak, but the judge slammed his gavel down so hard the sound cracked like a whip. "Do not speak, Mr. Langston," the judge ordered sharply. "Your high-priced lawyer abandoned you, and the public defender assigned to you strongly advised you to keep your mouth shut. I suggest you listen to him carefully." The judge turned his attention back to the massive pile of financial documents sitting on his desk. He flipped through the official bank audits I had provided, showing exactly how Preston had been siphoning money from Vanessa's event planning company and hiding it in offshore digital wallets. "The evidence of embezzlement, wire fraud, and tax evasion is undeniable," Judge Harrison stated. "The federal prosecutor is already preparing the formal indictment for Preston, and the rest of you are currently under active investigation for conspiracy to commit elder abuse and federal fraud." Clarice suddenly shot up from her chair, her seat scraping loudly against the polished floor. She ignored the frantic gestures of the public defender trying to pull her back down. "Your Honor, please," Clarice cried out, her voice echoing with desperate terror. "We understand we made mistakes. We panicked. But we are his blood. We are Theodore Langston's only family. He would not want us to starve in the streets. You cannot just leave us with nothing." Clarice gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles turning completely white. "We just need a living stipend," she begged, tears streaming down her face. "Just a small monthly allowance from the estate to help us survive. My husband is losing his job. Vanessa's business accounts are frozen by the bank. We have mortgages and car payments and credit card bills. We are going to lose our memberships and our homes. Please, Your Honor, you have to order Jordan to release some of the trust funds to us. It is our family money. We are entitled to something." I slowly stood up from my chair, buttoning the jacket of my charcoal power suit. I looked at the judge, keeping my expression entirely neutral. "Your Honor?" I said, my voice calm and steady, projecting clearly across the room. "My mother is correct that my grandfather established a massive family trust. However, she is entirely incorrect about her legal entitlement to it." I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a single thick red folder. It was the same folder I had kept hidden in my personal safe for the last 3 years. I walked smoothly across the courtroom and handed it to the bailiff, who passed it up to the judge. "Theodore Langston was a brilliant, meticulous man," I explained, turning slightly so my family could hear every single word I said. "He spent his entire life building his empire, and he knew exactly how greedy and treacherous his own children could be. He knew that the moment he died, you would stop at nothing to tear me down and steal the estate. That is why he built a hidden failsafe directly into the core foundation of the trust agreement." Clary stopped crying and stared at me, her eyes wide with sudden, paralyzing fear. "What failsafe?" she whispered, her voice shaking uncontrollably. I turned to face her, fully letting the massive weight of my grandfather's final protective maneuver crash down on them. "It is called the clawback clause," I stated clearly, ensuring the court reporter transcribed every syllable. "My grandfather legally embedded a strict, non-negotiable condition into the master trust agreement. It explicitly states that if any beneficiary or family member attempts to legally defraud the estate, manufacture false documents, or intentionally cause emotional or physical harm to the designated trustee, they immediately trigger a total, irrevocable forfeiture." Judge Harrison opened the red folder and scanned the highlighted legal text. His eyebrows raised slightly in surprise as he read the ironclad legal language my grandfather had drafted. I continued my explanation, my voice ringing with absolute finality. "The clawback clause does not just remove you from the will," I said, watching the color completely drain from Desmond's face. "It retroactively cancels every single financial benefit you have ever received from the Langston estate. It means you forfeit all future claims, and it legally converts every dollar my grandfather ever gave you into an immediate actionable debt. The luxury cars, the down payments on your houses, the startup capital for Vanessa's failed event planning business. It all belongs to the trust now. You do not get a living stipend, Mother. You owe the estate every single cent you misspent, and I am legally obligated to collect it immediately. Judge Harrison finished reading the document and slowly closed the red folder. He looked down at my family, and there was absolutely no mercy left in his tired eyes. The legal language here is pristine and incredibly explicit. Judge Harrison announced, his voice booming with absolute authority. Theodore Langston designed this specific clause specifically to protect the trustee from exactly this type of malicious coordinated attack. By manufacturing a forged codicil and attempting to defraud this court, you have officially triggered the clawback clause in its entirety. Vanessa let out a small, terrified squeak, burying her face in her hands, as the absolute reality of her complete financial ruin set in. Desmond buried his face in his hands, trembling visibly. I am officially ruling in favor of the plaintiff, Judge Harrison declared, lifting his heavy wooden gavel. I am signing an immediate emergency order granting the trustee full authorization to seize all available assets to satisfy the massive debt owed to the Langston estate. This includes the immediate seizure of your vehicles, the liquidation of Vanessa's remaining business assets, and the freezing and draining of all your personal checking and savings accounts. You have brought this total destruction entirely upon yourselves. The judge slammed his gavel down onto the sounding block. The loud, sharp crack echoed through the courtroom, sealing their fate permanently. We are adjourned, he stated, standing up and walking out of the chamber. The public defender immediately packed his briefcase and rushed out of the room, not wanting to spend another second with my family. The armed federal agents hauled Preston up by his arms and dragged him toward the side door. He looked back at Vanessa, his face pale and weeping, but she did not even look at him. She was completely paralyzed by the knowledge that she was now entirely destitute. I quietly packed my documents into my leather briefcase, snapped the brass latches shut, and walked out of the courtroom. The heavy wooden doors opened into the bright afternoon sunlight of the courthouse steps. I walked out into the warm Atlanta air, feeling a massive, crushing weight finally lift off my shoulders. I stopped at the bottom of the concrete steps and looked toward the street. Two large, heavy-duty tow trucks were already parked along the curb. My legal team had moved incredibly fast. I watched with quiet satisfaction as a burly tow truck driver attached thick metal chains to the front axle of Clarice's pristine silver Mercedes. Right behind it, another truck was actively hoisting Vanessa's expensive white Range Rover onto a flatbed. The heavy courthouse doors banged open behind me. Clarice stumbled out onto the concrete steps, her eyes wild and bloodshot. She saw the tow trucks hooking up her prized luxury car and let out a loud, agonizing scream. She ran down the steps, her expensive heels clicking frantically against the stone. She did not run to the car. She ran straight to me. Clarice collapsed onto the hard concrete, falling directly to her knees at my feet. She grabbed the hem of my tailored suit jacket, her hands trembling violently as she looked up at me with total, absolute desperation. "Jordan, please!" she sobbed, her voice completely broken and raw. "Please, you cannot do this. We have nothing left. We have absolutely nothing. I am your mother. Please forgive me. Please, Jordan, I am begging you." I looked down at the woman who had spent my entire life making me feel like an ugly, worthless disappointment. I did not feel angry anymore. I did not feel sad. I just felt completely, profoundly indifferent. I gently but firmly pulled the fabric of my jacket out of her desperate, grasping hands. I stepped around her crying, kneeling form without missing a single beat. "I am giving you the space you asked for on my birthday, Mother," I said, walking away and never looking back. The swift and absolute destruction of their lives played out exactly as the federal statutes dictated. Preston did not get his tropical getaway. He got a tiny concrete cell in a federal detention center. The IRS Criminal Investigation Division, combined with the FBI task force, built an airtight case of wire fraud, tax evasion, and massive embezzlement. Facing decades in a federal penitentiary, he turned on everyone desperately trying to negotiate a plea deal that never came. He wept openly in the courtroom when the judge handed down his sentence. Vanessa filed for divorce the moment his offshore accounts were frozen, but it did not save her. The clawback clause had legally stripped her of every single asset tied to the Langston estate. Her event planning business was completely liquidated to satisfy the massive debt she owed the trust. She was left with absolutely nothing but the clothes on her back. With their luxury vehicles repossessed and their sprawling suburban estate seized to repay the trust, Clarice and Desmond were violently evicted from their perfect high society life. They were forced to move into a tiny, cramped, two-bedroom apartment on the extreme outskirts of Atlanta. The brick building was decaying and completely infested with roaches. The elevator was perpetually broken, forcing my father to painfully climb 3 steep flights of concrete stairs every time he left the apartment. They were surviving purely on their meager monthly Social Security checks. The strict enforcement of the clawback clause ensured that any additional income they managed to scrape together was immediately garnished by the estate lawyers. But the financial ruin was not even the worst part for my mother. The public humiliation completely broke her spirit. The scandalous details of their federal fraud case and the forged codicil made the front page of every local business journal and gossip blog in the city. Clarice was formally and publicly excommunicated from her prestigious church congregation. The pastor actually sent a certified letter banning her from the property. Her elite sorority sisters, the women she had spent decades trying to impress, held an emergency board meeting and permanently revoked her membership due to the massive fraud scandal. She was entirely exiled from Atlanta high society. The wealthy women who used to attend her lavish charity galas now crossed the street when they saw her walking toward them. Vanessa was forced to move into that cramped, roach-infested apartment with our parents. The 3 of them spent their days trapped in that tiny, suffocating living room, bitterly blaming each other for their total downfall. The air always smelled of cheap, stale food and defeat. Desmond sat in a stained recliner drinking cheap beer and blaming Vanessa for bringing a criminal like Preston into the family. Vanessa paced the stained carpet, blaming Clarice for convincing her to forge the legal documents and ruining her youth. Clarice blamed Desmond for not fighting harder in court and failing to provide for them. They sat on cheap thrift store furniture, surrounded by peeling wallpaper, screaming at each other from morning until night. They had finally gotten exactly what they deserved, a life completely defined by the toxic resentment they had always harbored against the world. I did not waste a single second gloating over their misery. I was far too busy building the legacy my grandfather actually intended. I fully embraced my power as the sole trustee of the Langston estate, completely restructuring our vast financial portfolio to do some actual good in the world. My first major executive decision was regarding Big Mama's house. I refused to let that beautiful piece of our family history be tainted by the greedy, desperate memories of my mother and sister. I legally sold the sprawling ancestral estate to a prominent historical preservation society in Georgia. I negotiated a strict, ironclad contract ensuring the property would remain a protected historical landmark forever. It would be beautifully maintained and open to the public, serving as a museum that honored the true hardworking legacy of the Langston ancestors. With the massive influx of capital from the sale of the estate and the recovered stolen assets, I turned my attention to the future. I used the Langston Family Trust to establish a massive multi-million-dollar endowment. I created a comprehensive full-ride scholarship fund specifically designed for young, underprivileged Black women studying finance and forensic accounting. And I did not choose just any university. I partnered directly with Spelman College. I sat in the mahogany boardroom of the prestigious institution, shaking hands with the dean of admissions. I was actively reclaiming the exact same institution Vanessa and my mother had so cruelly used to mock my early academic struggles. The Theodore Langston Memorial Scholarship would fully fund the tuition, housing, and professional networking for dozens of brilliant young women every single year. I made sure that girls who had the talent but lacked the financial support would never have to rely on toxic, conditional family money to achieve their dreams. I spent my days mentoring these brilliant students, teaching them the exact forensic accounting strategies I had used to dismantle Preston's massive fraud. I was building an army of intelligent, independent women who knew how to spot a lie and follow a paper trail. My grandfather would have been incredibly proud. The story of my family is a masterclass in the absolute destructive power of greed, but my story did not end in that dusty probate courtroom. Exactly 1 year after the mediation, I was sitting at a candlelit table in one of the most exclusive high-end restaurants in downtown Atlanta. It was my 32nd birthday. The private dining room was filled with the warm sound of laughter and clinking crystal glasses. I was completely surrounded by my chosen family, my loyal colleagues, the brilliant young women from my firm, and the friends who had stood by my side when my own blood relatives tried to destroy me. I was genuinely happy. I wore a stunning designer dress that I bought with my own hard-earned money, and I felt completely at peace with the world. The waiter was just bringing out a beautiful tiered birthday cake when my phone screen lit up silently on the white linen tablecloth. I glanced down at the glowing device. It was a text message from an unknown unsaved number, but I did not need a contact name to know exactly who it was from. "Please, Jordan," the message read. "We have nothing. We are so hungry. Please help us." I stared at the desperate plea from Clarice for a long, quiet moment. I thought about the cold, empty hospital room where my grandfather died alone. I thought about the cruel birthday text she had sent me years ago, trying to break my mind so she could steal my future. I picked up my phone and pressed the screen, blocking the number permanently. I smiled a warm, genuine smile and picked up my crystal flute of expensive vintage champagne. I stood up and raised my glass to the wonderful, loyal people surrounding my table. "Blood makes you related," I said, my voice steady and clear, ringing out over the quiet dining room. "Loyalty makes you family. And when they show you they do not value your loyalty, show them the power of your boundaries and your bank accounts." The ultimate lesson from this story is that blood relations do not automatically guarantee loyalty or love. When toxic family members try to manipulate your past trauma or undermine your success for their own selfish gain, the most powerful response is not emotional retaliation, but absolute preparation. True strength comes from setting unbreakable boundaries, protecting your assets, and refusing to be a victim of their gaslighting. You cannot control the greed of others, but you can completely control your environment and your narrative. The greatest revenge is simply outsmarting your abusers and building an independent life they can never touch. Have you ever had to stand your ground against toxic family members to protect your peace? Share your story in the comments below and subscribe for more stories of ultimate survival and justice.